Welcome back, chess friends. It's match number 2, game number 2. At the moment, McDonnell is winning 1-0, so can he extend his lead or can Labourdonnais come up with something to retaliate against him? We have f4 from Labourdonnais, and Morphy, commenting in 1859, says, "A very good opening when an irregular game is sought." Okay, Morphy, we have d5 and a d4 from Labourdonnais. McDonnell says, "Enough of this nonsense, I'm going to try and gambit a pawn." But Labourdonnais is wise to him now. He got burnt last game with McDonnell's Evans gambit, so he just plays e3 to defend. We continue with knight to c6, knight to f3, knight to f6, c4, and McDonnell pins Labourdonnais' knight, but Labourdonnais doesn't mind, he just captures the pawn. And McDonnell just goes for the bishop capturing the knight, the queen captures back. The queen captures the central pawn, and we have a queen exchange already. So queen's off the board straight away. What's going to happen? Let's continue. Bishop to b5. Now Labourdonnais is pinning McDonnell's knight, but McDonnell also doesn't mind. He captures the central pawn. And now we have e captures on d4, and Morphy comments, "He should have first taken knight with bishop in order to leave his adversary with two isolated pawns on the queen side." Like this, two isolated pawns on the queen side. But that didn't happen. He captured the pawn first. Now we have knight to b4, and the game continues with knight to a3, backing up the bishop here. Castling queenside from McDonnell, attacking this isolated pawn with two pieces, you'll notice. So Labourdonnais captures the knight here with the bishop, but McDonnell has another knight which he recaptures the bishop with and maintains the two attackers on the pawn. So Labourdonnais develops his dark squared bishop, which adds one defender, but that's obviously not enough. So McDonnell captures the pawn and goes a whole pawn up, so good stuff. Labourdonnais castles queenside, and now you see that the knight has got two attackers on it. So McDonnell defends by pushing his pawn. But Morphy says, "This was uncalled for. We can see no possible objection to knight to c6. Okay, Morphy, that's not what happened. He played pawn to e5 to defend. And now we have a knight to c4. And Morphy again says, "Badly played. The single move, f captures e5, would have equalized the game." And actually the engine agrees, so Morphy knows what he's talking about here. Thank you, Morphy. But Labourdonnais did in fact play knight to c4. We have bishop to c5, adding another defender to this knight, and we have bishop captures on d4. And Morphy again comments, he says, "Labourdonnais seems bent on compelling his adversary to score this game. Here again he ought evidently to have taken pawn with f captures on e5. And again, the engine agrees. So Labourdonnais is not doing too well from all perspectives at the moment. So bishop captures, we have e captures d4, and now rook on h to e1. f6 from McDonnell, and rook to e6. And at this point, the engine says that a3 is much better. This is a terrible move and gives McDonnell a lot of advantage. But can he actually leverage this to get another point? We'll see. Rook on h to e8, rook on d to e1, doubling up, and we have a rook exchange on e6. And here, McDonnell decides it's the endgame already and brings his king into the game to try to chase away the rook, but Labourdonnais is not interested in retreating, so he pushes his pawn. So McDonnell brings some more weaponry to bear. He brings his rook across to threaten the exchange, and Labourdonnais goes for it, and the rooks exchange off on e8. So we're down to McDonnell with 6 pawns and a bishop against Labourdonnais' 5 pawns and a knight. Good stuff. Let's see if McDonnell can maintain his lead here. King to c2, king to d7, king to d3, king to c5, king to e4, king to b5, and it threatens the knight now. So instead of moving his king again, Labourdonnais retreats it to d2. But McDonnell just keeps coming with his king, and Labourdonnais decides he better keep an eye on that king and brings his own one back to d3. McDonnell brings his bishop up to d6, which threatens the corner pawn, so Labourdonnais defends with the knight while simultaneously attacking the central pawn here. So Labourdonnais defends with the bishop now. And Labourdonnais pushes h4, but this isn't such a great idea because it's now on a dark square and can be attacked by the bishop. Perhaps a better move would have been h3. But he played h4, so let's continue. King to c5, king to e4, and McDonnell here plays h5, which locks this white pawn onto the dark square. So very nice. Labourdonnais plays his knight back to d2 and McDonnell goes for b5. And here it kicks off a sequence of knight checks on the black king. So let's just zoom through these quickly. Knight to b3 check, the king moves. Knight to a5 check, the king moves. Knight check, the king moves. Knight check, the king moves. Knight check, the king moves. And with this last move, the knight's no longer got any checks, so it just moves back to a5. Now here, a winning move from McDonnell would be d3, because the king is forced to capture it, and this allows the black king to start heading over to the white pawns on this side of the table. And this bishop would be able to get in here and then capture this pawn, and just the dam's going to break. But McDonnell doesn't spot any of that. Instead, he decides to push his pawn to b4, which means the game is now drawing. So sad news for McDonnell and all of us McDonnell fans. But let's see how the game continues. Labourdonnais decides to carry on with his knight checks. Knight to b3 with check, the king goes to c4. Knight to d2 again with check, and the king goes back to b5. And once more, Labourdonnais run out of knight checks. He has to think of something else to do instead, and he pushes his pawn to b3. This causes Morphy to wake up. He says, "Knight to b3 would have drawn the game." Labourdonnais was not himself in this encounter. However, the engine disagrees with Morphy and says that knight to b3 is actually winning for McDonnell. So I'm not going to go into the line though, it's quite long. It also thinks that b3 is actually the correct move for Labourdonnais because it helps him to draw. So with that in mind, we carry on. We have a5 from McDonnell activating his last queenside pawn. And now Labourdonnais should play knight to c4, and then we'd probably get some repeat moves and it would be a draw, but he didn't play that. He played king to d5, which allows McDonnell to activate beast mode, and he starts playing like he's ingested a 21st century chess engine. He plays bishop to f4, threatening the knight, and now the pawn will be able to advance. And let's see how he does this. We have knight to c4, too late from Labourdonnais now. And we have d3 pushing the pawn, as we said. Knight back to b2, threatening it, but that's just going to keep advancing, isn't it? d2, king to e4, and McDonnell plays bishop to e5, threatening the knight, so the knight moves out of the way and blocks the pawn on d1. And now we have a bishop to g3. It'll have the option of picking up this pawn straight away, but it turns out McDonnell doesn't want to exercise that. He's got bigger things in mind. We have king to e3 and bishop to e1, locking it in on the back rank here. And king to e2 from Labourdonnais. King to c5 from McDonnell. He wants to bring his king down and around to help out with the attack. We have knight to e3, but the king keeps coming to d4. We have knight to c4, and the king keeps coming to c3. Now, Labourdonnais doesn't want the black king to get to c2 because then the pawn will just get across, so he decides to block on the back rank with his king. And now we have a4 from McDonnell pushing his pawns. The knight goes to a5, and McDonnell just captures, and we have a captures back. And this is now protected by the knight, of course. But the h-pawn is just sitting there waiting to be picked up. It has been like that for a long time. And we have knight to c4, and this is attacking the advanced pawn here. So McDonnell defends it with the bishop. And here, Labourdonnais decided to resign the game. So McDonnell goes 2-0 up in the second match. So awesome stuff. So why did Labourdonnais resign? Well, he's in a kind of Zugzwang, which means that any move that he plays is bad and losing. So let's just go through them all to show you this. For example, pawn to g4, the pawn captures, and now he's got two passed pawns to deal with, which is unstoppable. g3, well, the king can just pick up this pawn here, and again, we've got another passed pawn here to deal with, and it's going to be unstoppable. If we have king to e2, the black king's coming to c2, and now Labourdonnais is going to have to give up his knight to stop the pawn getting across. So now McDonnell's a bishop and a pawn up. Unstoppable. How about the knight to any of these squares? Well, again, the king's going to pick up this pawn, and you're going to have another passed pawn to deal with. You can't capture the advanced pawn here because, of course, the bishop's going to capture it. He could go to a5, you say, which defends this pawn. Well, in that case,
and this is the last option. In that case, McDonnell can just play some kind of waiting move, and now the knight's got to move again and undefend the pawn. So we're back to having this passed b pawn, for example. So that's why Bourdonnais resigned. And so that's completely amazing and awesome. We've got 2 games up for McDonnell to Bourdonnais 0 in the second match. So join me again next time to see what happens next.